it's a small customer, the commercial customer, or the big users, as Harry said. I think a lot of people, as I've seen, particularly in the South, call them the big dogs. And the big dogs eat first and the big dogs eat last, a lot of people believe. Those of us who had to represent the little dogs don't necessarily believe it has to be that way. And I want to explain to you some of the things that have changed on that. So, at any rate, let me get into some of these issues as I have seen them. When the smoke cleared today, this is what the landscape looks like out of all those bills that I mentioned. We had, let's start with New England, the high-cost part of the country where we have the nuclear power plants, which are interestingly closed down, the 3 Millstone units. The Connecticut Yankee unit has been closed permanently. There's talk about closing Maine Yankee. The legislature in Vermont suggested in their restructuring closing Vermont Yankee. So there's a huge battle. I think what made those New Hampshire regulators kind of surly was they were still getting rate increases for the Seabrook plant a couple years ago. They had already bankrupted. It was the first utility bankruptcy in the history of the United States when you look at the law that occurred in New Hampshire, and it was coming out of that and increases year after year that caused their concern about high rates. So this is a very high rate area. The one pamphlet that's in the Protect Michigan packet has got the color charts, a beautiful example of the rate disparity. So they're paying higher rates, the average consumer in that part of the country. First state out of the box really wasn't California. It was New Hampshire. And they passed a bill, and then Rhode Island did, which is this very small state. And then we go out to the West Coast, and we had California. And California happened last August. And as we get in, I'm going to go into each of these regions. I want to talk about kind of the dynamics of what happened. There was a exit fee law passed in Alabama, which Harry described what exit fees are. This is where the industrial users who were promoting retail access got rolled by the Southern Company and kind of served notice that all across that part of the South that the industrial users were going to have a hard time persuading legislatures to go to retail access. Then in Pennsylvania, and this is an interesting case, a bill that passed the House that dealt with regulating taxi cabs went into a Senate committee, passed the Senate, and with 4 or 5 legislative days left in a lame duck session after the election in November, an entire gigantic restructuring law was put into the taxi cab bill. And Pennsylvania became the 4th state to enact restructuring. Now, I say all that because a Senator Fumo from Philadelphia, I don't know if it rhymes or not, but he is contesting this bill as having illegally passed under the Constitution of Pennsylvania in terms of how fast it happened. It was drafted in a kind of a closed-door session. The consumer advocate, Sonny Popowski, a good friend of mine, signed on to it, but some other groups were not inside when the deal was cut. And so when I say you got to watch where the train is moving, this is a perfect example of what can happen in a major state. And even in California, the law was largely drafted by 6 legislators. And that is where public financing or securitization was first put forth. Now, what has happened so far this year? This year has been interesting. This month, we see Maine join this group. But we also see for the first time what are considered to be low-cost states. I said initially there were only high-cost states, and those are Oklahoma and Montana. And securitization is in the Montana law. The next law that we see that may be passing as we're talking right now is in Nevada. And I'll get into that in a few minutes. So you can see how the issue is growing. We had 4 states last year. Already at this hour, we have 3 and possibly a 4th one that have done major restructuring. Now, this chart is not in the handout, but when Harry said, and I say that this follows high-cost states, let me show you. When this first started, this was a perfect correlation. Here's restructuring activity along the bottom. These are where plans were adopted. This is the infamous Blue Book. Here is ordering plans, and here's no activity. Now you can see the kilowatt hour cost. So this side of the chart is highest activity. This is a NERA chart that was given in a conference in Tallahassee on their first restructuring conference that the PSC had that I was at. And I thought it really kind of says it all. Here's Massachusetts, Vermont, here's these New England states. Here's Pennsylvania, kind of right below the first tier here. And you can see here's Illinois, here's Michigan, here's Ohio. These are kind of the low-cost states that are bringing up the rear, and you'll see this. Now, what has happened now for the first time in the last couple months is we have seen Montana, here's Oklahoma, and Montana break out of the pack. We have seen low-cost states. One of the fears in the low-cost states is the fear that they are producing low-cost power that will be attracted to a large sucking sound, like California, for example, or it could be Chicago, and that their rates will go up. And this is a real live fear. When I've been to Kentucky and in Indiana, which are low-cost states, burning coal, they have a huge fear that the market is going to reach an equilibrium, I think is the economic term. So I wanted to put that up here because we're now seeing this move outside of those. Now, to me, the biggest untold story, and again, Harry mentioned special contracts, the big dogs. The lobbyist for Elcon, John Anderson, who has been on all of these programs, he will say rates should, we should have retail wheeling. He was in here, he's everywhere. I think you have to give him a lot of credit. He's probably the happiest man around. And what he says essentially is, now the industrials are saying everyone, including residential, commercial, should get lower rates. But the reality is that at the one utility commission after another, it's his clients, the big industrial customers, who have been able to cut deals even without retail access. Special contracts, by just using that as a kind of a sword of Damocles, hanging it over the utilities. He has said to me, Bill, we don't settle for less than a 30% reduction. So, having represented the little dogs, I guess the question is, and maybe they did come up with that in the men's room, Harry, where will the small customers be content with 10% when the big customers don't settle for less than 30%? This is Public Utility Fortnightly. If you want a list, this is the last list I've seen, July 15th. This shows all the states. This shows all the special rates at that hour. It would take a lot of work to try to put all these together. You would have to do it utility by utility, look at the last rate case. In my state of Ohio, we fought against special breaks during the recession of the early 80s when we had the largest unemployment since the Depression, and the commission and the governor was concerned about keeping business, as I'm sure they were here in Michigan, here in the Midwest, and so they gave breaks in the name of economic development. And what happened? Somebody has to make up that shortfall. And what happens in my state is that the consumer pays 50% and the shareholder pays 50%. Now, we lived with that because in places like New York, the consumer pays 70% to keep business in this kind of special rate discount. This is the greatest untold story. This is as close as I can come to telling it, but I think that it should be told because that is the price discrimination within a regulated setting that Harry was talking about. In other words, if you're a big enough player and you can threaten the utility with wheeling, you're going to get a concession. And I don't need to go into the details here in Michigan. I think you probably know what they are. But it isn't just Michigan. It's everywhere. And that is something that I think hasn't received enough attention. Now let me go through some regions here. This is the eastern region. This is where you're going to see the most activity. Maine just weighed in. I was going to do this separately, but in terms of time, let me give you some dates, and you can write these in. When would they receive full competition under the Maine law? The time would be 2001. Okay? In fact, I think it may even be 2000. I have to keep all these straight. You need a loose leaf mind here to keep all of it straight. The date that you're going to hear that is the closest to us in time is Massachusetts, 1998. That's in the bill that the governor has endorsed and in the what has come out of the DPU, which is their commission. and Rhode Island, 1998. Now, the Vermont bill looked like it was going to pass, and it passed through the Senate, got over to the House, and has been defeated. It had 1998, so Vermont is probably 1999. Connecticut had a bill that would have set retail access at 20% of the customers 1999 and the rest year 2000. So it would have been essentially Maine and Connecticut 2000, the rest 1998, and including New Hampshire. So you can see it's 1997. We're halfway through, and these states are talking about going to full competition by either January or July of 1998 in New England. In New York, there are pilots going on, and essentially the commission order was shooting for sometime in early 1998. Now, the power pool in New England is really in the New England states, and New York is in a separate power pool. And so I'm not showing you power pools. This is kind of a political map of what has happened. Then here is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is going to have, September 1st, supposedly, 250,000 people, or customers, most of them residential, who will be in pilots, 5% of the load, of 8 Pennsylvania utilities. This is a lot to keep track of, and it's a heavy burden on the regulators. And then by 1999, another third of what's left go, and then third after that, and third after that. So between 1999 and 2001, Pennsylvania goes. Now, the argument for all this is called, it's not the train, Spratley, it's the cascade. You know, once we start this in play, it will cascade down and will eventually move through the rest of the country. And you can see some evidence of that in just how the laws have played out. Now, what happened in New York is there's a very partisan situation on this issue, one of the worst probably in the whole country that I see, because I generally don't see differences between Democrats and Republicans on this issue, maybe shades, but it's not become a partisan issue. It is in New York. Governor Pataki proposed securitization. That's where the word was invented, was New York. This is the idea of the rate reduction bonds. It has passed the Republican Senate twice. It passed again in March. However, the assembly leaders, who are Democrats, oppose it and have put out materials called the securitization swindle. So and there are very high rates in New York. And there's a lot of taxes in the rates in New York, which is another big issue. And so this state is kind of, the only reason it hasn't moved is because of the partisan differences between the House. We now have a proposal in New Jersey from the board that would move in this vicinity also. And you get down to Delaware and it starts to shift yet. They really haven't looked at it. Now let me, I'm going to come back here to Connecticut on securitization because a very significant thing happened here that I think you need to know about as you start to face this issue. So that is kind of the way I have seen this. I'm going to show you where study committees are, which is the most predominant thing that we see. You have, I would consider, a study committee underway here in Michigan. There are some study committees that have budgets of $350,000 to $700,000. Legislative committees. I hear regulators say, gee, if they'd give the Regulatory Commission that, we could study it too. So this is a heavy-duty issue. And some of these states are not extremely populous states. So this is kind of probably where you see the most activity. These are small states. They're tied into a grid. They are facing a shortage of electricity this summer, if it eventually ever does get warm, because they have all these nuclear power plants down. Now let me move to the other side of the country, the West, where we've had California and then this year Montana. California has probably put the greatest amount of resources into this. If you were to look at their web page now, they have boards for everything. This law is, when you look at the law, it's 100 pages, 30 pages are bond language for the securitization. This is where it was put into law for stranded costs. It actually started up in the Puget in Washington. We have a bill that's coming through Nevada that the last I heard about it, which was last week, does not have securitization, interestingly. Nevada would probably be considered a low-cost state. And so again, if it acts, it will be a low-cost state acting. And of course, it's very concerned being in neighboring California. The interesting thing, however, is that Oregon and Washington bills both died. We have something called the Northwest, under federal law, Bonneville Power serves up here, and you have these four Northwest states. And this is the only one that has acted. Colorado is an interesting place. Dan Schaefer, the man who introduced the bill in July, that really, I think, forced the states to look at this, to see if they could meet this by the year 2000. It was a threat of a federal law saying to Michigan, if you don't act, we, the feds, will act for you by the year 2000. That really, I think, was an impetus. But the interesting thing, in Dan's backyard in Colorado, a study bill has been defeated again this year as it was the year before. A restructuring bill couldn't even get out of a committee. There is a great concern by the co-ops, who in this part of the country are very powerful forces, that this will be harmful to them, that they will end up like other rural services, whether it's the banks, the trains, the planes, what Harry talked about, where if you de-average the rates in the high-cost areas, we'll end up paying more. And I call this kind of the sagebrush versus Schaefer. So in his own backyard, his own state is not pushing for retail access. I think that's a very interesting fact. Could change quickly, though, as you can see, and I'll give you some examples of how things have changed quickly. In Arizona, there is movement towards retail access. New Mexico is another bitter partisan battleground. I mean, I'd say New York and New Mexico are top of the list in terms of partisanship. The legislature is Democratic. The governor is Republican. The governor appoints the commission. The legislature put an issue on the ballot, and you now have a lame duck commission. They now, and I don't know when the last time this happened, the New Mexico commission will now be elected. So you have lame ducks sitting there. There was a collaborative in New Mexico, and there are a lot of people that believe if you put all these parties in the room, they can work out a deal. Well, I can tell you, representing consumers, that the only time we ever cut a deal that was worth anything is when we negotiated from a position of strength. When we settled this Interior case, we dropped 11 appeals in the Ohio Supreme Court, which were worth something to the utility. What happened here, and you can see this is fascinating, it's on a website. You can see the meetings that were held, and you can see the give and take, and essentially the commission and the consumer groups walked out last week. I think the reason is because, and what was being held back were rate cases, the traditional regulation. What happened in that collaborative was that there was no leverage. How can the consumers negotiate? And when I say consumers in this case, I mean even the industrials, which in that state happen to be copper mines, as well as residential. How can they negotiate? And I'm talking to a bunch of labor people here who know more about negotiation than most people by a long shot, when they have no bargaining power. And so essentially the consumer said we couldn't meet the commission's deadline. The New Mexico Public Service Company has suggested this, and they said go ahead and have them file their rate cases. And at least there's a law that says they have to file these cases. I guess something that we all learned a long time ago from Harry Trebbing is when you have them by the rate base, their hearts and minds will follow. And it seems to me that that may be a real problem. In the legislative setting, where is the leverage for the small consumer? I frankly believe there's often a lot more with legislators and regulators. Legislators are elected. They don't want to be the scapegoat for this. And when I went around, I started here in Michigan, I delivered a message that was, you know, if you screw this up, it's not going to be Judge Green administering the AT&T system, as we did for our telephone utility for years. It's not going to be the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on gas. If this thing fails, people are going to come back to this legislature. And I think that is still a very true statement. The problem is who even knows this is going on. There are no rate increases necessarily pending a lot of places. It's not like the good old days when you had this huge waste going on, the overruns on the plants and so forth. But that is a fundamental fact. So I wanted to point out these states because you know, for every law that passed, there's at least a couple that got shot down. But there are more of them, and I think it's only a matter of time before what happened on the East Coast and the West Coast is coming in to the middle part of the country. You've heard that said, and in this issue, it's very true. When I was down in Florida, an old commissioner got up, Joe Cressy, and said, you know, we'll just wait around and let all these people make mistakes on the East and West Coast, and we'll do it right. And there probably is a lot of wisdom in that. I'm going to save Texas for last because it's a great story, as you might think about. These are very low-cost states here. Kentucky is just starting to look at this issue. Huge merger of the two coal companies in Kentucky. I'm going to show you a graphical depiction of the mergers that Harry talked about. West Virginia, they're very concerned about, again, being low-cost states, the power leaving, the cheap power, I guess is the way to say it in kind of their parlance. Virginia, North Carolina, we had a bill, and in South Carolina, we had a bill. In Georgia and Florida, and these are huge utilities. This is where Southern Company is centered. It goes all across this part of the country. They couldn't get a study bill passed. Florida Power and Light has over 3 million customers, one of the largest companies. They still have blocked any consideration in these states. This is a very large state in terms of population. Bill died in Mississippi. Louisiana, we've had a battle on the airwaves. What you're seeing in states is before even anything is even filed in the legislature, you see in this case, and I happen to have gone down to Baton Rouge, and you see wall-to-wall refineries. You see the big dogs taking on, I imagine in Louisiana, the little dog is Entergy, which serves 4 states. But you have a battle between big users, and they're actually going on the airwaves. And I want to talk about that a little bit more. Oklahoma. Oklahoma had a study committee that met for several years. The Oklahoma law is somewhat unique. It sets a retail access date of 2002. The date in Montana is 2002. So when the low-cost states acted in the middle of the country, they said, okay, we can do this 2002. Not next year, like California and Massachusetts, but 2002. And I think that that date selection is very interesting. This law essentially sets up a whole bunch of study committees to reach that date. So it doesn't really get into the mechanics of stranded costs and securitization and all those issues. But I think it's interesting that Oklahoma acted. You would find it interesting, as I do, that there's been huge consumer outcry in Oklahoma over gas prices. You can remember back, as I can, when it was kind of let the Yankees freeze in the dark in the oil patch. And now, in this last, with gas prices, even an increase relatively small by historic standards, you've had a lot of consumer backlash there. Now let me get to the massacre story, because this is really interesting. This is a story about a bill, and I happen to have been there in February. It was introduced by Mark Stiles from Beaumont, which is in a little piece of Texas over here that actually is served by Louisiana. Very upset because there have been storm damage. You know, I find it interesting, all the problems with reliability, and I have to say, those of you who are going to make the argument the lights will go out if we go to deregulation, you know, the fundamental problem is that the lights went out twice on the western grid under regulation. The lights went out in Beaumont. There are certain times when I don't care who's running the utility, that's going to happen. The question is incrementally whether it's going to be worse. And I think there is a good chance that it could happen when we look at the telephone industry. He introduced the bill. And this bill, which was the industrials bill, would have had a 15% reduction in rates. He wanted an upfront reduction. At the time, there was no securitization in the bill. That was something they did out in California or New York. We don't want that in Texas. The bill basically went nowhere. And then, bless their souls, the regulators did the right thing in Texas. Pat Wood, the chairman of the commission, in the Central Power and Light case, basically started disallowing part of the potential stranded cost of the South Texas nuclear project. He basically sent a message that rates were going to be reduced 10% under regulation. This is making regulation work. This is doing what Harry taught all these regulators to do. If they earn too much money, you lower the profits and the rates. Well, the utilities in Texas decided, well, hell, are we any worse off under Mark Stiles' bill? Shouldn't we? And then what they got into it in negotiations is they put securitization in to the Texas law. There then was the governor got into the act. Governor Bush held a news conference. The munis were kind of reluctantly on board. Consumer groups have been taken out of the picture. And I think from a political standpoint that it's clear that when the big industrials and utilities agree, it's very much an uphill fight for the average consumer to have impact in the political process. And the biggest problem is the constituency. Do they even know what's going on? You know, they're not the ones demanding this. So what happened at that point, and when I say at that point, this is about a month ago, the bill goes into the State Affairs Committee. And the room is full. They start a marathon hearing. They have to move the bill to meet the deadlines about a month ago. And the bill was killed by the co-ops. The lobbyists had appeared to sign on with utilities. They went back to the co-op members. And if you look on the web at, I think it's kilowatt.com, you'll see the argument of the Texas co-ops as to why they opposed it. And a lot of it was they thought the big dogs, the big utilities, would essentially take them over. And it was not well thought through and so forth. And it was the Speaker of the House, his district had co-ops in it. That was the turning point in Texas. And the consumer groups, they were putting out information, some of the best I've seen. Janie Briesmeister, here's Consumers Union. I don't know if you know at this point, I don't know in my state what the bonded indebtedness for the state is. This is the current debt for the state of Texas. This is if you securitized and issued bonds without a vote of the people. And you can see how this plays. You're talking to legislators. This argument's being raised now again in California. Come up with some numbers just to show what the amount of money would be in a securitization situation. And there are many more charts like that were put together in Texas. What then happened was, in the last week, and if you know anything about Texas politics, that's usually when all the laws are made, there was 80 bills, and there was an attempt to slide a restructuring amendment, this is kind of like the taxi cab bill in Pennsylvania, into the bill. A lady legislator, Arla Wogelworth, if I got it right, Wogelmuth, I think, stood up, found an arcane parliamentary procedure, killed 80 bills. The Speaker, what happened is they didn't actually read the notice of when the bills would be read. It was a very technical point. And so the massacre, they call it the Memorial Day Massacre, happened, and that ended restructuring. But up to that point, it was still in play. The governor was behind it. There were key legislators on both sides of the aisle. The co-ops actually were the critical point, and even to the nth hour before the massacre occurred, that bill was still in play in Texas. And it would have, I believe, I think it's about 2002 again, or 2001, somewhere in that vicinity, put retail access into effect. Now, here's where we live. This is the Midwest. There's only one great fight to talk about here, and it's interesting because this is as far as a bill has gotten in the Midwest, and it just happened. It's Illinois. The power grid into Illinois is this area here. The merger that Harry was talking about, Primergy of Northern States and WEPCO, Wisconsin Electric, would have tied together Minneapolis and Milwaukee, who could then wheel power down into the Chicago market, which is 80% nuclear power, which is very high cost. This bill, again, this is one of these stories where it all happened at the end of the session. There was an attempt to reach a collaborative, and the legislators, to their credit, tried open meetings, but what happens in these is essentially, and I have found this from my own experience in negotiating with utilities, no utility is going to write off voluntarily its assets. First of all, they can be sued by their board of directors and their stockholders. So that's a fundamental problem. The problem we have in these states is that in Illinois, you have the Chicago utility, and then you have the northern Indiana, and you have Cleveland and Toledo, very high-cost nuclear power, and you have some of that in Michigan. Then along the river here, you have very low-cost coal. And so you have within these Great Lakes states utilities that want to go slow and others that, the position of the Indianapolis utility is there should be no recovery of stranded costs because all its competitors have stranded costs. There are utilities that say that, not consumer advocates, but utilities, because that would be a comparative advantage to them. So this is important. It's going into a veto session, which will happen in the fall. The industrials don't like the bill, so we still have the industrials and utilities split. And I should say some of the industrials. It depends on, it's such a big state, who's where on the map. The Citizen Utility Board endorsed the bill, the consumer advocate, along with Commonwealth Edison. Silco, the southern utility, opposes the bill. This bill has securitization in it. So I would say that in the near term, the legislature to watch, as you are putting legislation together, is going to be Illinois, which is more like Michigan and Ohio. This is all part of the ECAR region. The bill in Indiana, again, the utilities were split. A study bill was turned in, or a regular restructuring bill was turned into a study bill. In Ohio, there's a study going on. The bill has never really moved out of one committee in 3 sessions. Kansas, they have a study committee that's spending $300,000. Nebraska, which is all publicly owned, has a study committee with a $300,000 budget. We're now starting to see restructuring in Missouri. There is a merger that ties Union Electric in St. Louis together here with a Illinois utility, and it'll be interesting to see what will happen in this state, a major state. Now, what has happened in Minnesota and Wisconsin? It was interesting, as Harry was talking about, what the regulators have done. In these 2 states, once this merger was announced, it kind of paralyzed everything, and they were very concerned. And what Harry didn't tell you, while FERC, using market power, using all of the antitrust measures, basically remanded the case and said, we're taking it back to a settlement judge. They didn't even really outright deny it. 2 days later, these 2 companies withdrew it. What had happened at the state level? And it is true that there was fine economic testimony put on, but led by the environmental groups, because they had not received enough attention. Now, this may be a case where the regulators, again, are at the heart of this. These 2 commissions were tied up. They got a court decision finding that one of the commissioners here should be recused because of conversations with the utilities on the merger. Same thing here. 2 of them stood aside. They couldn't find a 3rd commissioner for a long time. And the votes kept switching. So you had commissions that were basically neutralized. And part of it had to do with their conduct as commissioners. And that was kind of the politics of what was happening here, apart from all of the elegant economic arguments. The problem was that WOMS, which I think must come into here, was constrained. And this new Goliath utility would literally have market power across this transmission line. And that was the kind of technical reason that it was denied. Now, that's a very significant case, because up until that time, people were saying FERC hadn't met a merger it didn't like. This is a chart of 10 mergers. This was put in our March-April newsletter. You have this in it. This is our centerfold. This is, these are electric or combination companies. So these would be companies that have both gas and electric service or straight electric. Here's the Primergy merger. Now, this is already out of date 1 month later. This has been withdrawn. But in its place, you can kind of darken in Kentucky. We have Louisville Gas and Electric, a huge low-cost supplier that wants to be a marketer like Enron, tying itself together with KU. So one goes away and one is added. Now notice where these are. They're kind of in the Mississippi Valley, the middle part of the country, and the middle Atlantic states. So these are kind of more traditional companies merging. The other 10 mergers, and when you add both of these together, $200 billion worth of assets. You hear about stranded costs. You could argue this is the real restructuring. This is the corporate restructuring. The big get bigger. This is where an electrical combination company adds a gas utility. This is the Pan Energy. This is Duke Power here, which is in North Carolina, South Carolina, merging with a Houston-based gas pipeline, Pan Energy, and combining those two. So the interesting thing then is when you add these two together, and I overlay these charts, I love doing this, there's only two places where Wyoming and Texas, almost the whole country is affected by a merger. And as you can see, I said Kentucky is now filled in. And so you can see this kind of concentration visually, I think, and all the numbers that are involved there. Now, I want to just do a quick recap here of where all the restructuring studies are. The thing that we can say has happened the most is that legislatures study this issue to their credit. They are deliberative bodies. The Congress, most people believe Congress will not pass a law this year, even though this was a year ago, was first proposed by Congressman Schaefer. I say this is important because there's a lot of things that will be valuable to find out what works if you're looking at a legislative strategy, what was effective in states, say like Michigan, or states that would have a similar makeup. You can see that there was an interesting quote in Minnesota where the St. Paul Pioneer Press quoted, or I think they actually said, no legislatures dealt with this issue in one session. I think that may not be true in the case of Montana, but it's about true of everything else, even California. It is not something that is easily understood quickly. There are a lot of interests. It's a win-lose type of game. So I wanted to show you where all these were at this hour. And there have been states where even study committees have been killed off, Colorado, Georgia, Florida, as a threat because they felt we shouldn't even study this issue. So I wanted to give you that overview. Then I wanted to tell you about brand names, and this is what was run against the utilities in South Carolina. It's laid out in that LEAP letter. The LEAP letter before that, January and February, we ran a story that said they polled all the legislators in Columbia, South Carolina, and legislators said this ranks very low. Now, we went to press middle of January. First part of February, an outfit called Electric Light, owned by investors of Greenville, South Carolina, announced that it was going to sign up customers, that it would give every customer a 20% reduction in his bill if he would sign this contract. When you read the fine print said, this of course means that the legislature has to pass a retail access bill. Up to that point, only 5 states in the whole United States had passed a retail access bill. They signed up 17,000 people, took their case to the legislature. The bill is still alive, although it's probably dead, but technically it's still alive at this hour in the South Carolina legislature. Now, you remember I showed you the South, those other states where things have been killed off? One of the problems with this story is that people viewed this as kind of a front for Enron because they said they were going to get their power from Enron. I was in Charleston, South Carolina 2 weeks ago where all the consumer advocates met, and I happened to meet the man who is the president of Electric Light. Now, I don't want to mislead you. This is a separate group that put out the pig face, but there were millions of dollars spent. The utilities came back with, you know, we're your friendly utility, we're reliable, and the other side saying, hey, too fat for too long, these monopolies, 20%. It's a pretty persuasive argument. They said also, we will take the small customers first, the big customers stand in line, the big dogs stand in line. Another tactic. I met the president of this company. Who is the president of Electric Light? Again, it's not this ad, but Electric Light, L-I-T-E, Light. He's the former president of AirTouch, which used to be Cellular One. He told me he had just left a company where he had raised $700 million. He told me all the investors in Electric Light were South Carolinians. They weren't outsiders. And that they felt there was a market that, you know, up to 40% of the people would switch once they were able to deliver power 20% cheaper than Carolina Power and Light. What's interesting is that telephones, why is that relevant? A watt-hour meter on your house now, it's got all the dials you have. We used to teach people how to read their meter. Only a monopoly could put something like that on somebody's house. You know, real co-ops have cyclometer meters that look like a speedometer. At least you can see numbers. They would put, he didn't say he would do this, but this is essentially what a lot of people think would happen. They would put a little chip in there, would allow the meter to be remotely read. These are called automated meter readings. There are about 200,000 of these in the Kansas City area, St. Louis right now. And were put in place, and the plans for them even before competition started. Well, number one, that obviously removes the meter reader, but it also allows the telephone types to come in, who've got all the, you know, dial you up at 6 o'clock at night, marketing infrastructure, which the electric companies don't have, allows them to aggregate the small customers. This is kind of the techno fix. Now, this issue is dealt with in the May 6 California order, where California, and I thought this is interesting as I read Harry's summary of the Michigan order. In California, they will allow, January 1st, the unbundling of not only generation, transmission, and distribution. You would see those as separate charges. They will have meters and billing as separate charges. They will let a competitor come in and put a meter on as long as it meets certain standards that they will set. And they will allow the utilities to do this. But the utilities will not recover costs, as I believe I read in Michigan. So California's gone the other way if you go to the fancy meters. So there are some who believe that the aggregators of the future will be telecom, they will be cable. We will have, and I haven't heard this word yet, convergence, where you will converge not only gas and electric, as I showed you on the merger chart, but telephone, telecommunication technology. And that is how the transaction costs will be lowered to the consumer. And they will sell on an MCI kind of consumer by consumer basis. Well, some people think, well, you know, what about the last technology that's sitting there in the ground? We had it on a larger scale, nuclear power. What if they put this in and people don't buy into it? Are we creating another stranded cost? But I raise this to your consciousness because that is what we're beginning to see out there. And I wanted to tell you the story of South Carolina because that was a state that was viewed as kind of off the chart. Nothing's going to happen. And then all of a sudden, these guys are in play. The interesting thing is Duke Power is a huge potential competitor and is yet to weigh in. Okay, let me just go quickly. A few other things. Retail access pilots. Michigan started the pilot movement. We have the huge pilots. It's interesting. You can see where they are. They tend to be in the Northeast and the West. The South, they aren't. The Midwest, Illinois. There are a number of lessons that have been learned from these. There are some people who believe that pilots are a waste of time because they artificially discount the price. That won't occur necessarily when there is a true competitive market or effective competition. What Pennsylvania has tried to do is to learn from the lessons of New Hampshire. What happened in New Hampshire, which was the first pilot, 14,000 customers. The commission kind of took a hands-off view, and this was about a year ago. They said, let competitors come in. And they let them compete. Big issue that you'll hear about from probably David Moskovitz tonight is green pricing. If you want to support renewable energy, what is the marketing for that? There are some groups that say, okay, we'll give $25 if you choose our electric price to an environmental group. One utility gave away trees. Another one gave away birdhouses. There was one housewife who said, I took the tree, I took the birdhouse, now what do I do? So it became a very confusing thing for consumers. And they're just now starting to realize when they look at it, what was the controlling factor? Price. 60% said price was a controlling thing. So again, when this thing starts in earnest from these pilots, you're going to see something kind of a Madison Avenue type of technique being applied to what would be argued now as a commodity, that is the price of electricity. But these pilots are going to go forward in Pennsylvania, and they will be the first. This is what they look like. And I'm going to answer questions here because we're going to have to, I don't know if you can see all this fine print. This is at page 12 of that, if you have a copy. This is the way they were filed. And the way they were filed in Pennsylvania, you have some very high cost. Pennsylvania is just like those Great Lakes states. In the sense you have Philadelphia Electric with very high cost nuclear power on the east side, and on the west side you got very low cost power from the Allegheny system, which is part of a big coal operation here, Allegheny Power. So you can see the numbers of people, and you can see the kind of process that they went through. Now what the Commission has done is they have said we are going to discount the stranded cost. You remember the example that Harry gave of the exit fee, where it said, you know, if you have to pay that 25 added to the 75, how are you any better off? And the way these pilots were viewed by consumer advocates who have prevailed so far is that they've said, look, you've got to knock some price off of this, which is what happened in New Hampshire. And so we're going to see on a much larger scale than New Hampshire. This will be, I think, a very important experiment if it goes forward. It still could be stalled, although there's a law in Pennsylvania that says it will go forward. Up to 240,000 customers would be able to choose. And I point you to that because when the issue arises, what happens in pilots, I think what's happening in Pennsylvania is going to be closer to us than what happened in the very first kind of Wild West pilot that we saw in New Hampshire. A couple other things that I originally had up here that are in your materials. System benefits vary. I think David's going to talk about those tonight. What is a system benefit? Well, you have stranded costs, which tend to be the big nukes or the QF contracts, but you also would lose low-income assistance because in a competitive market, that isn't provided. If you have energy efficiency or demand-side management, you could lose that. There are several states. I'm wearing this photovoltaic solar tie, good day sunshine. Those of you that are beetle know what that's about. But the renewable energy development could be cut off. Funds that are now very substantial in states like California. R&D, research and development. And that definition has been expanded to include other benefits of regulation. And so what has happened in states is that they've put these into either wires charges or in the cases of renewables, a portfolio standard. But the bottom line on all this is that what we have observed so far is that if your state does not have, for example, funding for renewable energy, my state of Ohio doesn't. Pennsylvania did not. Pennsylvania passed a law that did not. However, renewables are funded through wires charges in Rhode Island and most of the New England states except New Hampshire, proposed to be in New York, California. So you have this kind of, it looks like a tax to a lot of people, but it would be a charge or funds that could be put directly on the wire to preserve kind of what are viewed as the benefits to consumers. And there are pros and cons, as you might imagine. The brand name or the consumer protection issues. I put in your package a resolution passed a week or so ago at Charleston by the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, which is all of the, again, state agencies that are charged with being, with representing consumers. In this state, it's the Attorney General's office. And they put together a list of what are the consumer problems that are going to arise. If you start thinking about it, if these aggregators come in, are they going to be reliable? Most states that are dealing with this will start licensing them. And if you look at that resolution, you can see a list. David Moskowitz will probably talk about disclosure. We want to be sure that people really understand what the price is. He would say, and I happen to agree with him, that the fuel mix ought to be disclosed. The people ought to know where their power is coming from. The environmentalists take that even a step further in saying the emissions, how dirty the power is. And of course, I come from a state that's 85% coal. So it's going to be pretty clear what that bill would look like if you disclosed it. Now, there are some that want to sell green power. I don't know if you've ever been over at Ann Arbor. I had the occasion to see the photovoltaic project that they're selling, green pricing. That's a rather expensive way to do it. I don't necessarily agree with the way they've done it, but I give them a lot of credit for at least going forward in this part of the country. Detroit Edison is the only utility that in the Midwest, in this part of the Midwest at least, that is trying to sell green kilowatt hours. Now, what would happen under a competitive system is a marketer would come in, and what the federal bills that are being proposed would do is they would give consumers options for green power. If competition were really to come about, and if you looked at it on a positive note, the consumer, the biggest issue that hardly anybody can argue with is choice. And the average consumer, you know, when you look at these surveys, 70, 80% say, yeah, I want a choice. You know, I don't need the power from that monopoly. Too fat for too long. I'd love to have a choice, but what kind of choice would you get? If you have this huge merging going on, you can see the problems of market power. I think the problems of price discrimination that Harry was talking about that came through the telephone side. If you could imagine choice through using using this telephone technology that would lower transaction costs so that it would be just as profitable or more profitable to serve those residential customers, where the customer would have not just a straight vanilla watt-hour meter, but might have an energy service provided to him. That could be a photovoltaic system on the roof or a fuel cell in the basement, or that would be on-site generation. You know, that's where the threat comes. When General Motors says we're going to put an aircraft engine and burn gas on a semi in the back of our plant, that's a threat. It always aggravated me because what could you say for the residential consumer? They really are the fire hydrant of last resort. The buck stops there under current regulation. In other words, the bailout, they will have to pay. And so how do you give choices in electricity to consumers? And I think the other thing that Harry said I think is extremely important is, you know, is technology really the driver here to a large degree? You know, I think consumers want this, but consumers have to be given technological choices. I mentioned that interconnection, for example. To interconnect a PV system, in some states they are pushing for net metering laws, where the meter would run backwards if you put a solar system on your house and the power goes into the grid when you're not using it. And utilities can block that by standby charges. There is not even in this country, even though there is in countries competing with us globally, a standard interconnection for electricity because we have 3,000 different entities. So we don't have, you know, and this was the way the phone industry, this was the same issue, Carter phone, 1960s, FCC said you don't have to have a Bell phone to hook up to the Bell system. Bell argued it would hurt the system if you put a non-Bell phone. Now, we take it for granted. We have throwaway phones. I personally think they're a lot worse than the old Bell phones in a lot of ways. Don't seem to last as long. But it's the same notion that if you get down to the nitty-gritty and you're competing, there will be, they won't call it price discrimination, there will be market segmentation. The market will be segmented. You will go for the most profitable. The utility will try to keep its most profitable customers. We saw Ameritech doing that. We'll find out who pays it the most. Those are the ones you want to keep. There's a danger of redlining. They will go into low-income, inner-city areas and draw red lines around and say, well, we don't need to serve there. That's why states are looking at provider of last resort to make sure that someone keeps the power on, because this is a matter of life and death. This isn't like selling bread or beer. This is a necessity. So those are some of the consumer issues that I think are going to be very critical. I think those resonate. What I find with legislators is the slamming thing. They all understand that. One of the problems is that they want to make too many analogies to telephone to electric, and there are a lot of differences. And again, you can see that the telephones, I think, are just, you know, laying on the side. I showed you the $200 billion merger. This latest merger of AT&T and SBC is $50 billion. Now, the irony is the telephones are not as capital intensive, but they've been out in the marketplace. And so, you know, now the rules are being changed, are being made up, they're shifting. It's a tough decision whether to cut a deal, for example. And you can see people agonizing. I'm on the Turn board out in California. Nettie Hogue is almost recanting her position. She stayed neutral as this bill went down. The press came in and said, well, Nettie, it's a 10% reduction. Isn't this great? Now what she's saying to people is that the present value of $400 million in rate cuts is really going to be put into bonded indebtedness of $1.5 billion. You can pay me now or pay me later. And the one thing that securitization does, for example, is that it guarantees recovery, a guarantee that the utility wouldn't have under normal regulation. Now, I would argue that we were only able to get maybe 15% out of a nuclear power plant as a cost overrun. But regulators, if they really regulated, were able to reduce costs. But those days are over, I'm afraid. And again, you've listened to an old advocate and an old regulator talk about competition. This is the picture as I see it. And I'd be happy to answer any questions and clarify. I brought this document with me because it's got all the details in it, so I've kind of taken some liberties here. Yes? No. No. Let's look at New England. The Connecticut bill had a securitization provision. I was going to come back to Connecticut. What killed it? So the bill has been killed off. There is no commission order. It's a very high-cost state, 80% nuclear cost, very high rates. What killed it was the Millstone units, 3 of them, are still down. And the legislators found it very hard to support securitization for power plants that were not operating. And they already had shut down Connecticut Yankee. So they have one that's permanently closed sitting there. I think that was the fundamental problem. And then the most outrageous thing had, and I've got the language of the next leaf letter. This is incredible. They put a provision in, and now everybody's running for cover as to who put it in. It said if you didn't pay that CTC, the stranded cost part of your bill, if you didn't pay that as a customer, these bonds that are really not full faith and credit of the state, but the state allows them to go forward, a lien would be put on your real estate if you owned it, and if you were a renter, a lien would be put on your personal property. It's right there in black and white. It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I mean, on the other hand, if you don't pay your utility bill, the consequence is it gets shut off. And that's what would happen in California. But I think they may have overreached in Connecticut. They're pretty close to Wall Street there. In fact, a lot of them probably live in Connecticut. And it's the most incredible thing I've ever seen. And those of you that are going to go forward and argue against securitization, even if you have to accept it and there's a lot of ins and outs, let me show you. Maine, in the new law, said let's wait on securitization, which is significant. They did not buy into it. Securitization is being talked about in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island on a voluntary basis. So that's what I know about it at this hour. But let me show you one other thing about securitization that I wanted to point out. I just heard this. This is a fellow that would be great to bring up to Michigan here. This is a 10-year period that these costs are going to be securitized. This is Virginia Electric he used an example of. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but let's say that right now they're going to securitize $3 billion in stranded cost up here going in. As the costs decline, what he showed was that if there is a variation of 0.5 cents per kilowatt hour, up or down, these costs could be $4 billion, or these costs could be a minus $1 billion. So, you heard Harry talk about the $100 a barrel oil and the PURPA contracts. The assumptions being made in securitization to make a utility whole, and we're talking about mega billion decisions. I showed you that chart from Texas, the biggest energy producing state in this country, 25 billion. If they're off by half a cent, over or under recovery, it's a crapshoot. What is the difference between that and the PURPA contracts that brought competition into play? I think it's a very telling argument that is one that you'll probably hear more of. And I think in Oklahoma they delayed a decision. We're beginning to see some rethinking now on securitization. So a couple months ago I was saying it's spreading like wildfire, but now we're beginning to see some retrenchment and some real hard looks. One of the things that can be done is only to securitize certain things. The leading case is Philadelphia Electric. A month ago, an administrative law judge, this was to securitize $3.6 billion. This is PECO, Philadelphia Electric. They had this first securitization law case. They asked to securitize 3.6. The administrative law judge came back and said this is a train wreck waiting to happen, and said they haven't proved their case in a short amount of time. Zero, because this is considered irrevocable bonds. One of the arguments used against securitization is how can one legislature bind another legislature? This is a very common argument in appropriation language. And these are things that are happening without a vote of the people. In a lot of states, bonds have to come up for a vote. He also said in the alternative, $300 million. The PUC, in a hearing room in which there were protests, this is like the good old days, in which there were protesters, some of them were even arrested, yelling at them. The commission decided to give them, I believe the number is like $600 million. Didn't give all of them, only gave part of it. This case is going to be contested because the whole law is being challenged and so forth. But that's where the battle on securitization is played out. California is the other place, and those are the places you need to watch to see what develops. Boy, that was a long-winded answer. Yeah. Yes. In Alabama, you would. I can remember in that first retail wheeling that issue is dealt with here in Michigan. I just don't know whether that decision is worth anything anymore. But I do remember there was a whole discussion of exit fees in your own state here. And in Colorado, there was a meeting that Congressman Schaefer attended, the Center for the New West. We're going to be describing it in the next newsletter. Happened in April. And the co-ops basically gave their point of view. They don't like competition. The Center for the New West is funded by U.S. West, another big RBOC. There was a picture of a turbo generator. Does anybody here know what a turbo generator is? Well, my wife, my assistant here. Oh, this is a past article. Okay, turbo generator is about 500 pounds. It's on wheels. It looks like a furnace. Goes into your basement, burns gas, and makes electricity. Now, the only problem I saw with this, it didn't have any cost figures. So I don't know how economic it is. And they were concerned about using this. Again, this is an institution that was financed, by telephone companies. They were pointing to this as the new technology for the small customer. Now, we've talked about PV and fuel cells. What I didn't mention, of course, I was down in Troy, Michigan here, where they're making PV cells that look like shingles. They're selling them to Japan. They're too expensive in general to sell into the American market. We have the ability to make this stuff here in Michigan, down the road in Toledo, solar cells, fuel cells, but right now, they're not within that 5% of price of being truly competitive. It's going to take several years to develop them. But this turbo generator, and I don't know whether it's going to go anywhere or not, it's just something that's cropped up. And it's Allied Signal has put this thing together. Again, there may be a huge interconnection problem here. If I can take gas into my house as a small customer and convert that into electricity, there may be all kinds of safety problems. I can think of a lot of problems right offhand. But there is a picture of this thing, and it's in this country. Now, again, there may be something that's going to go into the third world where a lot of the renewable is going right now because they don't have the money to build huge integrated systems that we have in the ground. Boy, that was long-winded, too. I still go back to being a lawyer, don't I? Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned what the securitization bond costs on a monthly bill.
Yeah.
Is that where they always are? If not, where else are they? And as a third question,
Yeah.
these sort of shadowy concession deals that the utilities work out with the so-called big dogs.
Yes.
Big dogs get out of the securitization.
No. In most cases, the word is non-bypassable. And I think most of us would agree that right now, there are ways of avoiding taxes and so forth. It would be a non-bypassable competitive transition charge. And this would represent the stranded cost, which in most cases are nukes, and what we call QF contracts, or the $100 a barrel independent power that is under contract. Most of this is on the east and west coast for QFs. The nukes are all over the landscape. So your bill would have this charge. I don't want to say it looks like the access charge, but in some ways it does in terms of something being put onto a bill that you would have the distribution charge, which is to pay for the local system. You'd have transmission, and you would have generation. This is the part that would be competitive. I showed you that chart of Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Commission just said that they were going to set a, is it 4-cent or 3-cent market price? They set a market price that will be kind of the benchmark for competition. Then in California, billing and metering was unbundled. So the bill would have all these components. This would be kind of the, you know, if you show fuel mix, this would often be the nuclear charge in a way. This is kind of like what it's going to cost to write down those stranded costs. So the idea would be a non-bypassable wire charge. The same thing with the system benefit charge, which is the wire charge that could be put on for low income, for energy efficiency, and so forth. And so every by kilowatt hour, they would have to pay that. And of course, the industrials don't like anything like that. They would better shift costs away. Is that clear to everyone what that bill would look like? Your bill is kind of like a telephone bill now. You know, can anybody explain to me their telephone bill? And that's the direction we're going. And they would unbundle these. They're going to do this in California, and they're going to do this in Massachusetts. And we're going to see pretty quickly the experiment there in Pennsylvania. Yeah.
What was the fee for frequency and what was regulation?
Fee for frequency ancillary services. Okay. Boy, this is a trick question here. Ancillary services would probably be part of the cost of the generation, I would presume, here, and it would come through the ISO. That's normally the way. In other words, this independent system operator will have to run the system. You know, I'm not as, if you make this work, we may have a more reliable system if you have an independent system that has control and has some real teeth. But the problem is, when you look at that Midwest thing, I mean, that was created down in Columbus. That's AEP. They're at the heart of that. You know, if you've ever been, you probably haven't been, you walk in their dispatch center, it's like, we're AEP, we control power in the Midwest. And you look at those huge 765 kV lines, they do to a large degree. And so they are proposing to be the heart of that. Now, some utilities are already opting out of that. And so, you know, these costs are going to be kind of arbitrated through here, the way I understand the system. Yeah?
Will any best guess what's going to happen?
I'm here to learn. I haven't been here since 3 years ago. I have a loose leaf mind, and I'm a really dangerous guy because I know a little bit about a lot of different places. And I would say a couple of things I would look for. I told you about Texas, where the governor lost out. However, in California, the governor was critical. Obviously, the governor is playing a huge role here. The relationship of the governor to the legislature is critical. In my state of Ohio, what has really snafu'd everything is a court decision on school funding. That's put a gun to the head of the legislature and said, you have unequal funding of schools, therefore property taxes takes the issue, is the #1 issue. That's happening a lot of places in state legislatures. They come down and say, hey, you know, education's more important than electric cost, is kind of their view of it. So I would look at, you know, the role of the commission in the Texas case, where the commission took a strong decision and almost arguably provoked the utilities into acting by forcing rate reductions. I'd say most regulators are timid as a whole on this issue. Some, however, are driving it. In the states where it's a big issue, in New England, as you can see, you have regulators that are really pushing it. So, you know, the election is the other big factor. Do you want to do this right before an election year? Interestingly, Pennsylvania was after the election. The thing is going back into Illinois possibly after an election, although it may be a local election rather than statewide. So those are kind of political dynamics. You know, all the stars have to be aligned. You know, this electric light thing, that just mystifies me. These fellows, when you sit down and talk to them, they really are from Greenville, South Carolina, and the commission forced them to divulge their investors. Now, they had been in big corporations. Ultimately, the competitors will probably come out of the industry. There are individuals that you see. This happened with MCI. The people that took on the telephone industry came out of it. And there's a guy named Peavy who used to run Southern Cal Edison. He's got something called New Energy Ventures. It's all the way up into Philadelphia. He's a marketer. He's buying power from the munis in California. This fellow I just mentioned that comes out of the telephone industry. You have utilities that have marketing arms you never hear about. You know, the chart I'd like to see are all the unregulated marketing arms. I didn't get into brand names, but, you know, if you watch CNN, there's Enron advertising. Utilicor's slogan, I love this, it's like the Dallas Cowboys. We want to be America's utility, Kansas City utility. You have Southern Company. You've seen this a lot of national press. They have a lot of figures with wires. And the story of Southern Company, a lot of people believe, is they favor competition everywhere but in their own territory. So you have, and this happened with the telephones. In other words, they may be out with unregulated subs in another part of the country, and these are utilities. I would imagine, just knowing what I know about utilities over my lifetime, that most of them have a game plan, and they have a date, and they have, if they haven't shown their hand, they will, and it depends on when that time will come. I think the process is critical. Some might argue that a backroom deal with just the key players might be the best public policy. Others would argue it ought to be an open process. There could be a backlash. Foreign investment. Over half of the distribution companies in the United Kingdom that serve real live customers are owned by American companies. When I was there with this Representative Stiles in Austin in February, he blasted the Texas utility. So they have taken excess profits and spent $7 billion in Latin America. I was just amazed. He sounded like a consumer advocate. And Harry touched on this. You know, where is the global map of why are all these investments being made? And I would say a backlash could happen. You know, British Telecom comes over and what? I was talking to a Brit the other day, and they say, you know, we own MCI. It's not like, is it MCI, if I got that right? British Telecom and MCI? You know, what happens in this country when Nippon Electric comes in and takes over Southern California Edison? You know, once you get in that game of international types of, I don't want to sound xenophobic here, but I'm just saying that, you know, once you start changing ownership, it gets like the oil industry, and the Texans are very conscious of that and very kind of anti-oil. We're talking about international corporations. And is that what's going to happen to our friendly local utility that's been under state regulation? If these mergers happen, the first thing that happened when I was in front of the Minnesota legislature, they lose jurisdiction. All of a sudden, the calls aren't being made necessarily in their state. It's now a holding company outside the reach, and they had to go to FERC. And, you know, that's the kind of issues that you're going to face. Is bigger better? It's really an issue, you know, that I think is a baseline consumer issue. The question is, how do you articulate it so that consumers will act on it? And it's going to be a tough one because, you know, unless you're in a situation like New Hampshire where you're still getting rate increases for the last nuclear plant, it's going to be tough to organize because people just, you know, are not aware of what's happening, and it's happening quickly. You can see that it's doubled the number of laws. Yeah. I think low income has come out pretty well so far. In fact, I would say the common denominator is that the legislators will protect low income assistance. I would say that if I were arguing for the other pieces of benefits, I would try to get on board with the low income advocates. And I think the low income advocates should be in a kind of a leadership role because, you know, the system should be one that's open so that all consumers have access to it. And I think that, you know, that, I would say, you know, they vary, but we really haven't seen low-income programs hurt. We've seen the others. in New Hampshire, no demand-side management, for example, in New England, even though the rest of New England is very pro-energy efficiency, and programs exist all across New England. So, yeah, I would say that it should take nothing for granted, you know? I mean, the legislators, I think, will be kinder on that issue. I mean, I think that goes without saying. Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess the question becomes, are you going to put state money in place of federal money? Or will you use the rates as a tax? In a lot of states, the tax issue, in my state of Ohio, the utilities are taxed at 80% of their value. Any other business is taxed at 25%. So they are arguing, let's replace that with a sales tax on the bill. Then the question is it revenue neutral to the state coffers? Supposedly in Pennsylvania, they worked this out. The tax issue is enough to block this in the short term. And I don't know the politics. I've heard things about sales taxes and so forth here in Michigan. But when I appeared in front of the Ohio AFL-CIO, you know, the people that, out of 1 million families that are in that in those unions, only about 12,000 work in utility unions. The most powerful union apparently now is the school teachers. And you know, what essentially, and they actually came out at one point with studies that show what would happen. And of course, it's all tied into this larger issue of tax equity for schools. So that's another piece of the political puzzle that, you know, we've observed. I could keep on going, but I want to thank all of you. It's been very interesting for me. I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. My wife Faye and I are going to be here through dinner, and I'd like to meet as many of you as possible and get some sources as things go forward here for the LEAP letter.